Thatcher, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. This is a highlight of my day.
Thanks, Ben. It's really nice to be here.
So I want to talk about your new book, The 12 Monotasks, and we will, I'm sure, explore lots of dimensions of this concept, which I think is brilliant. And I don't know why the word hasn't been made more prominent, but congratulations on the book, and we can talk about all those things. But before we do, it would be great if you could just give my listeners a little bit of a pen portrait of you, your background, all that good stuff.
So my name's Thatcher Wine, and about 20 years ago, I started selling books as a hobby, and I built this whole career. I have a company called Juniper Books. We curate libraries and make these special edition book sets. And, the company's grown a lot. It was never intended to be a business, to be honest. It was just something I was doing kind of in between careers. These days, I'm also an author. Just came out with my second book, as you mentioned, the 12 Monotasks, do one thing at a time to do everything better. So I think a lot about, books, other people's books, and then my own books these days, and encouraging the world to read and have more books in their homes and their offices like you do, which is great. And I'm also a parent, have 2 kids, and just kind of, live a busy entrepreneurial, creative life, and wrote the book largely based on my own experience and curiosity on how I could do it even better.
Fantastic. You mentioned something there I just want to double click on for a moment, and that is that you never intended Juniper Books to be a business. And so at what point did you realize, this could be a business? And
Yeah, the way I came to it was kind of interesting. I was a lifelong reader and collector of various things. I always had like a stamp collection and a coin collection and a few books that I collected. And I loved going to antique stores and estate sales. But then when I'd started an internet company, an online customer service company, 1999, and we ran out of money in 2001, couldn't raise any more venture capital. That year was particularly difficult for a lot of startups. And one of the things I started doing was selling books that I'd buy. I'd go to estate sales and country auctions. I had a friend from college who was like a 3rd generation bookseller. I followed him around. I was like, this is really fun. And this is like the opposite of what I've been doing for the past few years, staring at a screen, trying to, launch this rapidly growing startup that didn't work out. Like, this feels really healthy to me, holding a book in my hands, researching it, looking up whose name was in it. Was there a book plate? Was there something interesting about, the story of that particular copy in that edition? And I just kept doing it, loved it. And kind of found that I was good at it too. Like, I'd uncover some treasures. So financially, most people don't think of rare books as being like that financially rewarding. It's more of a hobby, gentleman's hobby or something. But the niche that I discovered that was totally different, that nobody else was working on, was building collections for people. And it turned out there were a lot of people that were, had a lot of other things in their homes that they'd, had experts curate and procure for them and make look beautiful. But there wasn't really anybody doing that for books. Mm-hmm. And I found that if I really did a good job listening, both to the clients when they said, here are my interests, this particular period of history, this type of philosophy, my kids are into these sports, we love these artists. And then I also understood their visual aesthetic and maybe their interior designer and their preferences. I could not only get them the books they wanted, but I could make them look beautiful. And at a certain point, I invented the custom book jackets too, which was a way to kind of rapidly transform what books look like. So I could make them all uniform colors or make them all look like antique leather if they weren't. Or we could do these images that go across the spines of multiple books and across the multiple shelves. So it was really fun. And that's what made it a business, kind of discovering that niche and that need that customers had that wasn't being met by anybody else.
It's a confluence of interest and then, I guess, a little bit of serendipity.
Yeah, and I think maybe applying a lot of the lessons I had learned in the past as I'd started the other company and worked for other small businesses, and I'd been in consulting for a little while. I'd been in finance briefly. And so maybe just, I apply all the skills of listening and, finding things and pricing things right. And, and the other thing is it's fun. I've been doing it for 20 years. And I feel like we've just barely started on the potential. It's a 20-person company now. We ship all around the world. But, books are just full of unlimited potential, which is great.
Yeah. And physical books, I think, are making a bit of a comeback as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Nice to see. Be part of.
Right. So let's transition into monotasking. You did mention a few things there about all of the skills, right? So all of the skills, and your story is really interesting. And I am curious if you could maybe share a little bit around how this became a book. Like what led you to writing this particular book?
So, we all live in the 21st century. We all have kind of the same distractions that we face. A lot of them have to do with our phones, and other devices that are nearby. And a lot of them have to do with just like having a lot of stuff to do, long to-do list, never enough hours in the day, whether it's related to your family, your work, or travel, sports, hobbies. And then on top of that, a few years ago, I went through a series of kind of next level distractions, all back to back to back. A couple of them were health related. One of them was cancer. So I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, went through pretty heavy duty chemotherapy for that. And no sooner had I recovered than started the process of getting a divorce. And I have two kids that were a little smaller, younger then. And I was so distracted by those things that my business suffered a little bit, and I had to work overtime, extra time to put that back together. And I got to the point where I couldn't do it all. I was exhausted. I was, trying to do everything well because I had been, I'd done that well for years, had been creative and successful. And I thought, why can't I do it anymore? And the further I kind of fell behind, the more I tried to keep up by doing more stuff, and a lot of it at the same time, which is multitasking. So I kind of sat down and thought about, well, when have I been the most successful and creative and productive? And can I reconnect with that? And is there something I can learn there, maybe that I can share with other people too? And that's when the whole monotasking philosophy was born. And it was really about, slowing down, breaking apart your tasks, the 3 things you might be doing at any given moment, whether you realize it or not, choosing to do one of them, do it well, finish it, maybe take a break, go for a walk, go play with the kids, do something else, then come back and move on to the next task. And what I found is if I really implemented this, I did everything better, and I made fewer mistakes, ended up getting more done. And I felt way more connected to the people I was spending time with. Just became a better listener, a better parent. And so, writing it down, and then kind of I started thinking about, I thought a lot about books and reading, like what's the place of reading in the 21st century? And I really think of it, reading a book as being the opposite of a smartphone. Like a book consolidates 100% of your attention on the printed page. If your mind wanders while you're reading it, you have to go back. You don't get anything. Whereas a smartphone is like constantly encouraging you, like, do this, do that. You can see this notification and open that app and respond to that person, and you can do it all. But you can't really, and you may not realize that. So I kind of codified it all into a philosophy that started with reading. And then I thought, well, if you can pay attention to other activities in life with the same intention and presence and focus that you pay attention to a book, you could also strengthen your attention span. So the other monotasks, and we'll talk about some of them, include things like listening, walking, sleeping, playing, creating. And so the book is all about how you can use basically all these everyday activities to build your focus. And then you can apply it where and when you want to do life better.
So let's maybe just get your, what do you mean by monotasking? And I like the reading analogy, because I think what you're saying is you can be reading like 5, 6, 7, however many books at a single period of time, but you can only be reading one at a time. Is that more or less what we mean by that?
Yeah. So I mean, you're combining a couple ideas. One of them is like the main premise of Juniper Books, which is like you can only read. You should have all these books around you, but you can only read one of them at a time. So the other ones should look beautiful while they're waiting on your shelves. Asking you to come back and read them. And then the second idea is when you choose that one book, whatever book it is, the only way to read it and absorb the information is to give it your full attention. So your attention is focused on the printed page, and so if you watch the movie version of that book, like let's say it's Dune, you'll get half the information if you're multitasking while you're watching the movie. But if you read the book, you won't get any of the information if you're multitasking. And I think that's a feature. That's not a flaw, right? So that's how books are designed. Like, they not only do they entertain us, they inform us, but they like strengthen our attention. And if you look at the world and really successful people like Warren Buffett or Oprah Winfrey, they tend to be really serious readers. And it's not just because like they're learning all this information and they use that to become successful. I think there's a correlation between their ability to pay attention and build their focus, and then their ability to be effective in the world. They can carry that through from the practice, the hobby of reading, to everything they do.
And you mentioned technology there. It seems to me, pretty obvious that that's one of the blockers, or one of the reasons why we don't do that. You also talked about the series of personal crises back to back to back, and I lost my father to cancer earlier in the year, and after this sort of, I'm in a place where I almost feel like now, before it was sort of grief, but now I feel like life is short, man. Like, you have to get on with it. And I'm struggling, and I think a lot of other people are struggling for other various reasons, maybe pandemic related, of life is short. Life is short, and at the same time, I'm finding I'm running into this challenge of monotasking, because I've got to do this and this and this and this, and it becomes really really difficult. And I'm just wondering what your take on is, why is this becoming such a challenging thing to do?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry for the loss of your father. I think the challenge itself is not particularly new. Like, I think human beings, just by our nature, always had a hard time paying attention, and we're susceptible to distractions. Some of it's, by evolutionary design, so that we're aware of dangers out there, things lurking in the night, and we can pay attention to multiple things at some level, to a certain extent. What's happened, I think, in the 21st century and the 20th century too, like as we invented computers and then smartphones and all these apps, like it's accelerating. And I think there's more competing for our attention than ever before. In the 1970s and 80s, like we'd see 500 ads per day as we went about the course of our day. These days, it's 10,000 or more ads. And a lot of them we don't even notice. They're subliminal. So there's definitely like an economic incentive to get our attention. And that's what, the phrase, the attention economy is all about. Like, how can our attention be harvested for profit? And if you think about it in terms of, so some companies like Facebook or whatever realized, gee, we could, get this person's attention through this app and that notification and this kind of information on their feed. But what if we like get their attention 3 times at every particular moment? And that's where like the tech-driven multitasking comes in. And then the big tech kind of thinks, well, if we can convince the viewer that they're actually good at multitasking, well, then they'll keep clicking on all of it, and they'll be hooked. And I think everybody listening, and myself included, can relate to that feeling when like you should put your phone down, but you can't. Like, it's just so addictive. And you've got work to do and places to be or whatever. So yeah, I think it's a challenge we all face, and I think we have to do what I call building our monotasking muscles through activities like reading, listening really, intently in a conversation. And then the stronger those get, the more we can resist distractions that, are driven by other people, and not get hijacked by social media. So the book is not like totally anti-tech. It's very realistic. Like, this is just the world we live in. This is the skill we have to develop, and, just develop some awareness of, when your attention is within your own control and when it's being hijacked by others.
And why 12 of these things? What is it? Did you just come up with, write them down and then, whittle them down to 12, or did it just, magically there were 12? Why the focus on 12?
Yeah, I mean, I 2.5 years ago or so, I made a list, and
Mm-hmm.
going back to the cancer conversation,
Yeah.
you know, definitely a lot. Like, so that was basically 2017
Right.
for me, and while I was going through it, I wasn't one of those people that's like, oh, I'm gonna survive and I'm gonna like check off these things on my bucket list.
Mm.
It was more just an overall awareness that like life is short,
Mm.
and yeah, I could dwell on the past, I could obsess about the future, but the only thing that really matters is the present moment. That's
Mm.
like where everything happens. And living in the present moment is very much related to monotasking and just
Mm-hmm.
paying attention to what's happening in the present moment and paying
Mm-hmm.
attention to one thing. And so as I started making a list of maybe books I wanted to write and kind of ideas I had about, how to like translate that into a philosophy that maybe could become a book, the 12 monotasks essentially appeared. um, and because I thought about like, what do I do on a regular daily or weekly basis? What do other people do? Kind of what are the universal activities that people have in common?
Mm-hmm.
The only one that changed a little bit was the one called Getting There,
Mm.
was originally just driving. It was
Mm.
basically about texting and driving.
Right.
And then my editor and publisher were like, not everybody has a car. Um, some people commute. Can you broaden it out? Make it more applicable to trains, planes, and boats or whatever. Yeah, so it's a fun chapter about like traveling and commuting and things like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the other things, I mean, some people I recognize don't read books today. Um, and other ones, may or may not be super applicable to people's lives. But I wrote the book so that you can find something in there that works for you. And maybe you practice all the other ones and you come back to reading and you realize, oh, wait, now that I've got a stronger attention span, I actually like reading.
Mm. Well,
Yeah.
let's maybe talk a little bit about reading and listening, because you mentioned not everybody reads, and audiobooks and podcasts are having a moment. I find there is a really big distinction when I listen to a podcast versus an audiobook, in that I'm kind of passively listening to a podcast for most of the time. But if I stop paying attention to an audiobook, I lose it. Just like very, very similar to reading a book, and you're just not there, and you just sort of go back. You need to go back and rewind, and so they are very distinct activities. But there, so maybe let's talk a little bit about reading and listening, and maybe the distinction between those types of monotasks, and how do you become a better reader, or if you're not a reader, maybe a better listener.
Yeah. So since we talked a little bit about reading, I'll jump into
Yeah.
listening a little bit. And especially since we're on a podcast.
Yeah.
And I think, one of my tips for some people that like have a hard time listening, like can't pay attention in a conversation, or always like tempted, like my kids maybe, to like have their phone out. Oh yeah, I'm listening to you. Are you really listening or not? But one of my tips is like, listen as if you're recording a podcast. As if like, would you be happy with, the conversation that's happening and your ability to listen if you heard it played back to you, and try to just like elevate your level of listening to, as if you were in the recording studio. Another one is like, listen as if your life depended on it. And I think that like, if you can basically take your listening to such like an intense focused level, it should feel uncomfortable, because virtually nobody does it these days. We're like so used to people half paying attention that when somebody really pays attention, you're like, what's going on? Like, why are you looking at me that way? Why are you listening so hard? And I think like then you can dial it back to a more like normal conversation, but to like take it to the edge. And I think that's what happens essentially with reading, because there's not a choice to half read, right? You basically have to read with your full attention. So then if you listen with your full attention, it's the same thing as reading. And then you're like, oh, there's all this stuff between the lines that I didn't even know about. And don't overthink about it. I talk a little bit in the book about, don't overthink your response. Like when you're listening to somebody else, just think of like, don't be so obsessed about like, what am I going to say when they're done talking? Like just relax and, find that happy medium. And I think what you'll realize like is just in our 21st century life, we're just missing a lot of the human connection that we used to have. I mean, there's, as all of, life progresses, like feelings of people getting, of loneliness are just off the charts, and anxiety and depression. And I think a lot of that can be counterbalanced to a certain extent by just being more present. Sorry, that's a weird glare. And yeah, so I think, the book is meant to be very helpful with a lot of tips that people can just apply in their lives. And not 100% of them are going to work, but they'll find what's useful for them.
I'm reminded of that Peter Drucker, I think it was Peter Drucker quote, that communication is what the listener does, which is a great quote. And I was listening also to another podcast, and I think Audible has done some research around when someone listens to an audiobook versus actually reading it, that the intimacy part of the brain gets more switched on, which I think is the same thing that happens in a podcast. Mm-hmm. And when you're listening intently, you're actually connecting more with the other person, which mm-hmm. I think may go into the the point about loneliness, because connection's a lot harder these days.
Definitely. Yeah. And I had so for the audiobook version of the 12 Monotasks, I recorded just like the introduction and the preface, and then I listened to the auditions of professional narrators for the book, and ended up working with an actor narrator named Dan Bittner. And I really thought about essentially what you just said, like what would the listener's experience be listening to these, these voices? Would their attention be held? And not only that, like, but, one great thing when you read a book is like your imagination kind of conjures up this like three-dimensional world with colors and characters and spatial dynamics, what happens in the story. Like, so I really tried to think about, would the listener experience that, hearing this person's voice? And I think it's successful. I love how the audiobook came out. And at the end of the audiobook version, there's what's called a bonus conversation that I had with Dan, because I was so intrigued by how does he do this? Like, I went into the studio and just read my 2 short chapters, and I was like, I wrote a whole book about paying attention, and it's hard to like pay attention and read it exactly as it's written and have the timing all be the same, but also have it be interesting and the intonation, So yeah, so I asked him some of those questions in that bonus conversation, and it was really fun to just hear how he does it, because he's done, over 1,000 books or something at this point, and they're all interesting and engaging.
That's great. Yeah, you probably just sold a few audiobooks there, but I think that it's challenging to. Listening is a challenge, right? Because we're always half listening. In my day job, I attend a lot of video calls, and people are half there or a quarter mm-hmm. there, right? And it's so easy to get away with it. It's so easy to to just look at your phone or scroll through and kind of half notice things, and we go through life like that a lot of days.
Yeah, no, I mean, like the pandemic and working from home, and it's so full of distractions and temptations, and because a lot of them, like, it's your own little secret. We think we're getting away with it, and but who are we really, like, what are we accomplishing? If we're doing this interview and I'm answering an email and my kids come in, or my dog needs to go for a walk, or whatever, like, I mean, there's can be a million different things going on. And they're going on all the day, as everybody's on the Zoom calls and everything. So the last 2 years, have been a next level distraction for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think, recognizing that there's nothing inherently wrong with alt. It's just a habit that we all have as humans to, if we have the option to do multiple things, we might do it. Mm-hmm. Either because we think we're really good at it, mm-hmm. and, nobody else can do it, but we can do it. Or it just might be like pleasurable, or we might just be like, I don't really care. Yeah. Like, it doesn't matter if I do my best work on this or not. And so it's not that you have to monotask every single thing all day long,
Right.
but you should have some awareness of it, and then choose the things that actually are important to you and the people who are important, and you do want to listen to them with your full attention.
Mm-hmm.
And then, feel the difference between multitasking and monotasking.
Mm-hmm. Can we transition to another one of the 12 monotasks, and that's playing? We've talked about this on this show a few times, because to me and to a lot of my listeners, playing is about embracing uncertainty, right? So figuring, just we learn in some ways through play, but it's also pleasurable. And also as adults, we don't do it very often or very well. We don't set time aside for it. And I think our quality of life diminishes as a result. And I'm just curious as to why you wrote that chapter and what some of the monotasking principles around play are.
Yeah, I love the way you describe it as, involving the embrace of uncertainty. Because, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I don't think I mentioned that in the book. It's just like there's so many ways to think about play and how it just like, brings us out of our usual self. Mm-hmm. And like depending on how you're playing and where you're playing and how much you're playing and, how much you let yourself go and how much you don't think about work, like so many good things can happen. There are entire books that are written about it. And that idea of like, you don't know where it's going to go. Mm-hmm. And that's a good thing is great. I talk a little bit about in the introduction to that chapter that like, I'm not that great at play historically. I do all the things. Like I go to lots of concerts. Mm-hmm. I ride my bike a ton. I love playing with the dog and the kids and skiing. But historically, like, do I sometimes find myself like standing there, 10 feet from the stage thinking about work? Yeah. And, and having to like stop on the ski lift and send an email. So it's something I have to remind myself to do, not just to like go play, but to like detach from work, like really let go and, really enjoy myself and use play to reset and recharge. It's not just like another place you go to multitask and, get your work done while you're on the treadmill. Like, I think you should really make it completely separate and monotask your play. And giving people permission to monotask things, I think, is really helpful in the world we live in. And there's only an upside. I mean, yeah, if you decide to like quit your job and join the circus or something, maybe there's a downside for your employer, but maybe it's great for you. Mm-hmm. I guess that would become your work. So maybe that's not a great example. But yeah, I mean, I love, I keep pushing myself to, take breaks, play more, and when I do it with my full attention.
So how do you monetize? Monotask. There's a Freudian slip there. Monotask play. How do you monotask play? Do you just sort of set like, look, 30 minutes, we're gonna play with this, or I'm gonna play with my kids or my dog or whatever? Like how could the average adult build that into their day? What have you found that works?
So most of the tasks in the book really involve like a 20-minute monotasking exercise, if you will. So go for a walk for 20 minutes, go read a book for 20 minutes. And the same could be true for play, but some forms of play, like taking the day off to go skiing or weekend, like obviously take longer. But the important thing to know is like you can do it in an increment of 1 minute if you wanted or less. Like the point is not how long you do it or what you do. It's that you give your full attention to it. And so, I could write a whole book just with ideas of playing opportunities. But, it could be anything from playing a card game with your kids and really just being present, playing and laughing. It could be taking your dog out to the park and playing fetch. If you're into sports and hobbies, like the idea is not to like go train for a marathon. It's to like go have some fun, go for a run. Yeah. And if you're like so obsessively training for a marathon, like I raced mountain bikes and stuff for a few years, and I got to the point where I was like totally exhausted and I wasn't doing it for fun anymore. And then I retired, from my mediocre racing career. And it's way more fun now. And it's like, so yeah, if you are training for a marathon, like go skip in the park or go, dive in the, off the diving board. Like, do something that you don't associate with like work and exhaustion, and that's, has the possibility of burning you out. Do something that like refreshes and recharges you. And if you have a meditation practice, you might be familiar with the concept of like another idea comes into your head, you just let it go. Like, just acknowledge it. Don't judge yourself for always getting distracted. Just let it go. So it's the same thing with play. Like, if you're out on your bike, or whatever else you decide to do, even if you like go to the pub, and some idea comes to mind about work or what happened yesterday, like, just acknowledge it, just let it go. Come back to the present moment. It's all about the present moment.
Yeah, I think we beat ourselves up over things like that. You're on your bike and all of a sudden you think about the report that's due and say, I shouldn't be thinking about that, and it just makes the problem worse. So it's just, I like that. Acknowledge it and then let it go.
It's human nature. You're never going to fix it. It's just acknowledge it, let it go, and bring yourself back to the present moment. Yeah, that's where everything happens.
To me, closely related to play is creating. And so you have another monotask about creating, and I'm wondering, first of all, what the distinction is there to you, and what monotasking of creating also looks like.
Yeah, so some of them definitely, the monotasks in the book overlap. Examples might be creating and thinking, or creating and learning. Like, sometimes I even lose track. It's not that important to have a really rigid distinction. Mm-hmm. The definition, like, I have a really broad definition of creating, which is just to bring something into the world that didn't exist before. That could be like the toast, that you make for your kids today. Like, nobody's made that toast ever before. The way you put the cinnamon sugar on it, it's amazing. Could be coming up with a new way to get to work. Could be, changing your workout routine. Do this machine before I do that one. Or it could be, I'm going to write a novel. I'm going to, really pursue my career as an artist or a musician or something. But it doesn't have to be like a professional creating title. And so I think if you and a lot of people, will also be kind of hard on themselves, like you said, and think like, oh, I'm not a creative. I don't have any creative ideas. I'm going to leave that up to the other people. I don't think that's true of anyone in life. Like, everybody has creative ideas all the time. And some people these days might have that like FOMO, fear of missing out, as they look at everybody else's social media and whatever. They're like, oh, they're so good at it. I could never be that good. Don't look at their social media. I mean, just like focus on your own creativity and take pride in it and celebrate it. And the way that you can, maybe become more creative, if you don't think you are, is to monotask it. So you're probably not going to write, a Nobel Prize winning novel if you're watching Netflix and have Spotify on and are carrying a Snapchat conversation. You probably have to focus. And it doesn't mean you have to sit at your desk and focus for 10 hours a day. Nobody can do that. Do it in small increments where you can truly monotask it, and then, see what you can come up with. And there's a few fun exercises in the book about like just coming up with fun ideas for movies and books that, that you've had, because almost everybody's like, watches something and it's like, I could have written that, or that was my idea. I could do that better. Write them down, and celebrate it and be, and then like once you start the process of recognizing your own creativity, you never know where it'll go.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about the benefits of monotasking? And sometimes I think people multitask because there's a lot of anxiety around it, and it kind of feels like we'll be more productive if we do all these things or try to do all these things at once. And it almost is counterintuitive to say, well, if I focus on this one thing for, an hour or 2 hours, then I'm going to have all this other crap waiting for me on the other side, and it'll never end. And I might as well just try and do little bits of, bits and pieces here and there. And I'm just wondering what you've learned about monotasking and productivity.
So basically all the studies have shown that, most people think they can multitask, but only about 2% of people can really do two tasks at once that are cognitive, truly paying attention to two different things, not listening to a podcast while folding laundry, for example. That's background tasking and a primary task. And then there's also another definition that's helpful is task switching.
Mm.
So when we think we're multitasking, like, oh, I'm going to do that report while responding to the emails, et cetera, and being on the Zoom call, we're really just switching from one task to another. And I think a lot of people can relate to like kind of like a little bit of brain fog that happens. You're not, and then a little bit of like delayed reaction getting from one task to the other. And studies have shown that it takes like 15 or 20 minutes to get out of one task and really get into the other one. And yet we think we can just go from one thing to another. Like, oh, I'm just going to respond and then come back to this. Like getting your brain back to do your best work on that report takes time. And, so what the benefits of monotasking that I've found are essentially that you increase your productivity. So you think you're going to get less done by monotasking, but you end up getting more done. At first, like, don't be worried if things take more time. Mm-hmm. And if they tend to be like they take a little bit more out of you, like they take a little bit more brain power. You have to refresh a little bit more. But once you get into the habit of it, you'll get more done. You'll definitely make fewer mistakes. All the studies have shown that people are just error prone when they multitask. And then the other thing is that you end up experiencing less stress and just that feeling of being overwhelmed that maybe you can't quite put your finger on. And, like if you saw my desk, I've got like 46 Post-it notes over here of all the things I need to do. I'm never going to get to all those. Definitely not going to get to them all if I do them all at once. The best chance I have is to like go through them one at a time. But if I try to do like, all of these, if I picked up one of them at the same time, I would just I'd have like a cognitive bottleneck about like, which one am I working on? Am I doing it right? Am I ever going to get it done? I need to go take a nap. I need to go for a walk. I can, that one's too difficult. I'll do that one tomorrow. One tip I mentioned in the book that works for some people is to like start with the hardest thing on your to-do list. A lot of times we'll just procrastinate. And by the time we get to that one, it's like, I'm too tired. I don't have the energy. I can't remember how to do it. So sometimes crossing that list off the list, that takes 3 hours. And then you get to all the other ones and those take 5 minutes. So there are a lot of ways to kind of play with that awareness of monotasking and multitasking and put it to work for you when you really need to be productive and do your best work.
Mm-hmm. What you said really resonated about the interruptions, because I think we've all been in that place where we'll sit down for 2 hours worth of work, we think, and we try to multitask, and then the 2 hours go and you feel like you've done stuff, but you haven't. You just, where did that time go? And you're tired, and if you've been task switching all that time and losing 15 minutes every time, well, that's where the time's gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And then like you may end up with nothing to show for it, or a little bit to show with it for it, and then you like, again, you're hard on yourself, like oh, like I never get stuff done, or my to-do list is always so long and now it's longer tomorrow. And I don't think productivity has to be complicated. Like I think there are a lot of books written about productivity that they just like, it becomes needlessly complicated. It becomes like a thing in itself.
It's a whole industry
on your list. And I wanted to come up with something that was so simple that people were like, oh, I just have to pay attention to what I'm doing right now. I can do that. I don't, I read the book and I'll go back to the book, but I don't like need to have like I don't need to take a course. I don't need to go on a retreat. I don't need to like only do that one day a week. Like you can do it at any given time, anything you're working on, anywhere you are. Just decide, I'm not going to multitask. I'm going to do one thing at a time. I'm going to see how it goes, see if I get it done, and see how I feel about it.
And I'm also looking at the diagram on the cover of your book, and one of the things I quite like is it's a circle, so it's sort of holistic. And then thinking about productivity, well, it's also about recovery, right? And you have a chapter on sleeping, and that's something else that we struggle with is when we're really supposed to be resting, we often aren't, and we've got our phones next to our beds, and we're mixing all this stuff up, and we can't be productive that way either, because we're actually not focusing on just gotta get rest now, man. You have to take a break now, and recover so that you can do that. And that's quite like that just the visual that is to my right of the screen of like all this stuff kind of connects, and visually it's appealing.
Another copy right here.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so what you're describing. I basically use a camera aperture metaphor, to convey the idea of focus and the idea of when you look at the book cover, like you have to do one thing at a time. You have to read all the text on it separately. So you look at the very center and say, oh, I'm doing one thing at a time. And it definitely it should have this kind of wheel of life feel to it when you look at it. Like, yeah, these things kind of make up our daily or weekly life. And like, I can kind of rotate it and, I can look at it from any angle and decide to do that one. Okay, and do that one. Like, they're all good for us. Sleep, you mentioned, super important. I mean, everybody needs to get more rest. Sleep, I'm so happy there are like a lot of books and research being done about sleep recently. And it changes the conversation, especially here in America. Like, there's a lot of glorification of people that like never sleep, and they
sleep when you're dead.
Yeah.
All that stuff. Yeah.
And I don't think that's healthy for society. So I think that's the conversation is changing. And, sleep is not just something that happens when you're so exhausted from life that you fall asleep, right? These days especially, and it was me like a few years ago, I would go to bed with my laptop because I had so much work to do, and I'd, work until I fell asleep. And, that's just super unhealthy. Like, I wasn't actually sending good emails or doing whatever I was doing. I wasn't getting enough sleep. And that, all the studies on like blue light and, looking at our devices before we go to sleep or picking them up in the middle of the night basically show that you become agitated and you don't get into the restful state that you need to be in to get all the types of sleep you need. And, so if you need to, I wear this Whoop strap that monitors my sleep. A lot of people use, other biometric devices. When I started wearing this, I was like, oh, I'm sure I get 7 or 8 hours of sleep because I go to bed at, 10 and I wake up at 6. Turned out, I was only getting like 5 hours of sleep. There were all these wake ups I didn't really know about. And then I wasn't getting enough REM sleep when you dream, or deep sleep when your body heals and consolidates your memories. So monotasking our sleep isn't just about like getting 7 or 8 hours of sleep. It's about like making a plan throughout the day to get the sleep you need at night. So, make your room cool and dark and go to sleep at the right time, stop eating and drinking fluids at a certain time. Like, make the little changes that only come from paying attention during the day, really. And then the next morning when you figure out if you got enough sleep and how you feel. And then, and then everybody should just get more sleep, especially, New Year's is a good time to like, it's a little dark, set new habits and make a resolution to get more rest that you need. So you'll do everything better in life if you get rest.
Yeah, I picked up an Aura ring just just last week, and I'm going through the same cycle as you, whereas like I was in bed for like 7.5 hours, but I only slept for 6, and it just forces you to, well, maybe you need to go to bed earlier and maybe not eat dinner that close to bedtime and all this other stuff. And I find it starting to make a bit of a difference, but you just don't notice these things. You don't notice them. You just think, go to bed. That's it.
Yeah, and it's a recurring theme in our conversation. Like, don't be hard on yourself if you're not getting as much sleep.
Here's another thing that you
don't obsess about the data.
Right.
Because you could look at it all and be like, oh, like what if I tweak this and that, and then it's like, oh, I have to wait another 12 hours before I go to bed and test that. So it's like, it's a process. We can't choose whether to sleep or not every given day. So you have your whole life to work on it. Might as well start now.
Yeah, you talked about your monotasking muscles, and just wondering if you could share a few tips and maybe exercise or things from the book around like how could we just exercise our monotasking muscles a little better.
Yeah. So monotasking muscles I basically define as, easily as our ability to pay attention and to control our own attention and not have it be controlled by companies and other people. And the way we strengthen our monotasking muscles is to do the things we do every day, like reading and listening and walking, but with a like new level of attention and focus, so that we're not just like doing a good job with that activity, but we're actually like strengthening a muscle as if we're training for a marathon or building some muscles at the gym. Like we have these muscles in our brains. We're letting them atrophying by being distracted all the time and fragmenting our attention. You got to put them back together and strengthen them. And a few quick tips that I have are do one thing every day that strengthens your ability to pay attention. My favorite thing to do is read. Read for 20 minutes a day. This morning, didn't get a great night's sleep, decided to stay in bed, and I read for half an hour and felt great. And thankfully, my dog, wasn't begging to go out, and I could do that. Another tip is to go for a walk. So, go for a walk for 20 minutes a day and don't, no offense, but like don't listen to music or a podcast or an audiobook.
Right.
You can choose to add that back later. But go for a walk at least once a week where you don't do anything besides walk. Listen to like the sounds under your feet. Try to see things you've never seen before. Don't take pictures. Don't make a phone call. And really just try to be present with your walk. Might be a little bit boring to some people at first, but you'll come to appreciate it, and it builds your monotasking muscles. The third one I would say is to, we mentioned it before, but like listen in at least one conversation a day with that really heightened level of focus and awareness, as if you're recording a podcast or, your life depended on it. And then, choose to apply, take that approach like every now and then with the people who are really important to you. And I think what you'll see, over time is that like, your friendships will become closer, your loved ones, like you'll communicate better. Maybe, it'll be a little bit contagious in terms of how they listen to you, so that when you really need somebody to talk to, like they'll be around for you. And that's a good thing.
I'd like to explore a little bit about how you pulled this book together. So what research did you do? How did you go about getting some of the background? Did you do some self-experimentation? Who did you talk to? How did you pull this thing together?
It was a really fun process. Definitely a lot of it started with my own personal experience. And then I broadened that out with some research and into both neuroscience. And then also like there's not a lot of research out there on quote unquote monotasking, right? There's some research on attention and focus and multitasking, but very few people have ever used the word monotasking. Some people use the word solo tasking or single tasking, and that's very similar. There is a lot of research on mindfulness, and it's highly related to that. But I made a conscious decision with the book to use much more like secular terminology.
Right.
It's very practical, and that nobody's going to like read it and be like, "Ooh, I don't want to like go into that mystical Eastern stuff." So it's very accessible to everybody. And, as I wrote the exercises, because each of the 12 monotasking chapters has an exercise or two, I gave those to people to test out and see if they made sense. Fortunate that I have a business that I could test out a lot of these concepts as well. At first nobody knew what I was talking about, but then like as they, I kind of crafted the terminology and like where to meet people in terms of where they were at. I definitely adapted the book a lot based upon their feedback. So by the time I had, written the early drafts, a bunch of people had read it, given me feedback. I found the right balance. Like I didn't want it to be an overly academic research, science-driven book. I'm not a scientist, not a researcher or an academic. I want to be like a very experiential book for people like us, who are high-achieving, busy people, and a lot of times when I read those very academic books where it's just like fact after fact after fact, studies, and like proving the point over and over again, it's like I don't have to do that. Like I've lived my life. I've used this philosophy. I know it works. I asked other people about it. It's different. It's original. Let's, put it out into the world. And if a scientist or researcher or academic, hears this or reads the book and then says, I want to do a study on monotasking, that would be awesome. Definitely send me an email. Let's do it. I did rely, as far as the research in neuroscience, like on studies that had been done on the benefits of reading, for example, or listening skills, and tried to integrate those in a way that was also very, accessible to people.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for the distinction between monotasking and mindfulness. I was going to ask you that very question because it seems like there's some overlap there, but no, that you explained that really, really well. Thank you. I was also wondering about, and I want to bring this a little bit back to the theme of this book or this podcast and your book. We talk a lot about risk and uncertainty on this show, obviously, and I always say embrace uncertainty, which is kind of like play, and but at the same time we need to have some principles, and there's a sort of a continuum of how much certainty we want and need, how much uncertainty, and a lot of what is that we can never control outcomes, what happens to us, but we can control process, we can control the quality of our decisions that we make, etc., etc. And it strikes me is that your book fits into that space really well, that we can control our attention and our ability to be present, and we kind of have to tune out all the extraneous stuff that could be luck driven. It could be, outcomes could come from lots of different places, and so that's what I like about your approach in relation to this podcast. And I don't know if you have any of your thoughts around how you go about dealing with uncertainty or making big decisions or risk in your own life that may be connected to the book, or just generally your own personal philosophy on how you go about things. Grateful if you could share if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, at a fundamental level, just thinking of monotasking versus multitasking. When you're multitasking, you're more prone to make a bad decision because you're not giving it your full attention. And a lot of the multitasking that tends to happen these days is, you're kind of outsourcing your attention, your thinking, if you will, to other people, whether that's your device, like, oh, I don't need to remember that phone number. My phone will do it for me. But people do it, when it comes to like investing. I don't need to, know everything that, all those people on that discussion board, clearly they've done it. So I'm just going to follow them. And maybe it works out. Maybe it doesn't. The opposite of that is to monotask it and say, like, I'm going to pay full attention to it. And if I don't have the skills to pay attention like a professional risk analyst does, like, I'm going to do the best I can by monotasking it. And maybe I'm going to use like some of the concepts in the learning chapter to like learn some evaluation skills that I didn't know. But it doesn't have to be, about buying a stock or anything. Like, just I think about minimizing risk while I'm going out for a bike ride. I used to listen to music. I don't anymore.
Right.
I think it's become, much more dangerous in the past few years. And I want to have my full attention listening for cars, because when I drive around, I see how many people are texting and driving, and I don't want to be that person who's, biking next to them. Can't 100% control that, but if I, just have my full ability to focus, then I can hopefully avoid some dangerous situations. So I mean, I think a lot of it just comes down to monotasking versus multitasking, and saying like, what's the outcome that I want to have here? Like, do I want it to be the best possible outcome? And can I achieve that by monotasking, my thinking or my creating and giving it my all? And then, there are other times when it's like, you just want to chill and, tune out a little bit, and maybe you're in the company of other people that, have made a plan for how you're going to get to the, the restaurant or who knows what. And you can make that decision to just turn off the monotasking muscle.
That's great. That's great stuff. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm conscious of time and want to be respectful of your time. But was there anything that you wanted to mention that you don't think we got a chance to cover?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really great conversation. I've enjoyed it. I think we covered a ton of ground, a lot of the monotasks and the philosophy. And if definitely people want to hear more, I don't know if you were going to mention the book or if I should mention the book.
I'll give you plenty of time to,
Yeah.
to mention the book,
Okay.
but just in general, if you thought, and also what's next for you? Like, do
Yeah.
you have a future project in mind, or?
Definitely, yeah. And I should say just on like the evolution of monotasking as a philosophy and how it's like applied in the real world. If people want to reach me, I have a website called monotasking.tips. I'd love to hear people's stories about like what makes sense to you, what worked, because a lot of people, what I'm hearing so far is people are like, oh, this is like so simple. I already do this, or I used to do this, or, I could do that. And just hearing the stories about how it's applied in real life is awesome. I love, hearing how it's, changing people's lives. And then next for me, so still running Juniper Books and growing that, just bringing more beautiful books and book sets and collections to people all around the world. I have several other books I want to write myself. I think my next project is to finish a novel that I've been working on for years.
Nice.
And I need to like follow the monotasking principles to create that. I can't just half pay attention to it and have it just be another, thing on the to-do list. Like I have to make the time. So once kind of the initial publicity is, advanced for this book, I'll probably move on to that.
Right on. And I'll put all that stuff in the show notes. And for people, are you active on social media if people want to follow you and etc.?
Yeah.
Have you got a newsletter as well? Have you got that?
Still working on the newsletter. I mean, people can join the newsletter. I haven't sent anything out. It's an interesting thing. Just to talk about it for 1 second, yes, I'm active on social media and trying to find the right balance between like helping people versus distracting them through social media, which is, I write about in the book as being a distraction. So, people, so definitely in a lot of like the self-care people on social media that are sending, 10 posts a day, it's like, that's not self-care. So, looking to find the right balance and definitely accessible. And I love hearing from people and seeing other people's posts.
All right. I'll make sure we get all that in the show notes. And you make some really interesting points. And I think if I read somewhere, but artists and people that spend a lot, like composers and people like this that might spend 5 or 6 hours a day really focusing on their, their next magnum opus or whatever the thing is, and then they just let it go, because you can't create great work all the time and be hyper productive. And I think your book is great because it offers a counter narrative to a lot of the stuff that we've been hearing, hustle hard and hustle culture, and even if it's people aren't saying that overtly, as you say, 10 Instagram posts or whatever it is, or 10 tweets a day or however many, we can't keep up. So
yeah, it's like that's a really good example of a musician or somebody, the act of creating was creating that. And then we've created this whole society that's like, oh, it doesn't end there. Like now you've got to market it and, build your personal brand and your following and look at your likes and do your collaborations. And then, I think it can weigh on, creatives and people that, just everybody really that like wants to do a lot of things and needs to kind of move on to create the next amazing thing. So finding that balance is really hard, but we're all in it together. So I don't know if anybody's really figured it out.
Yeah, and it's almost like we're creating this sort of everything's a transaction, and every transaction can be monetized. Yeah. And someone's got a business of, about how to increase followers or whatever it is, and what I love the 12 Monotasks because it is such a counter narrative to all of that. So congratulations on the book. It's fantastic. And wish you all the best. And I'll make sure that everything goes into the show notes. And but this was great. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Ben. Really appreciate it. It's great talking with you.